Liam stood at the front of the classroom, his eyes scanning the room. The students were all gathered around, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. His reputation as the Earth's toughest student had always been a joke among them. He was the guy who claimed to survive things no one should ever live through. But today, something was different. The usual bravado in his voice was gone. His eyes were serious, intense, as though he had seen things no one could possibly understand. "All right," Liam began, his voice calm but carrying an underlying tension. "You all wanted to know about the Deathworlds. I'll tell you. But understand this. It's not a story for the faint of heart." The class fell silent, a sense of unease settling over them. Some leaned forward, intrigued by the weight in his words. Others exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether this was just another of Liam's tall tales. But today, they would learn the truth. Liam took a deep breath and started. "There's one world I'll never forget," he said, his voice growing colder. "It wasn't just dangerous. It was alive. Alive in a way I'd never imagined. The planet was called Dreleth, a name that should have told me everything I needed to know, but I was too arrogant to listen. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could survive anything." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The class was captivated now, all of them hanging on every word. Liam continued. "Dreleth wasn't like other planets I'd been to. The sky was a sickly green, and the atmosphere was so thick with poisonous gases that it burned your lungs the moment you took a breath. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the creatures. They weren't like the predators we know. These creatures, these monsters, were designed by nature itself to hunt and kill. They were the apex predators of that world, and they didn't care about anything but feeding." Liam's face hardened, his memories surfacing in his mind like ghosts of a nightmare. The other students watched him, wide-eyed and silent, as he continued to speak. "Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of a dense jungle. The trees tower above you, blocking out the sun. The ground beneath your feet is soft and squelching with each step. The air smells rotten, like something had died long ago and was still decaying. And you can hear them, the predators, watching you, waiting for the right moment to strike." He paused again, his eyes scanning the room. The tension was palpable. The students could almost feel the weight of his words. Liam was no longer the boy who joked about surviving. He was someone who had seen things that shouldn't exist, and now they were learning the truth. "I thought I was clever," Liam continued, shaking his head slightly. "But I was nothing. The creatures on Dreleth could track a person's heartbeat from miles away. They could smell fear. I knew that the moment I stepped foot on that planet, I had become prey." He took a long breath, his voice lowering, becoming more personal. "For days, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made my heart race. I couldn't let my guard down for a second. These creatures, they weren't like anything I'd faced before. They were quick, smart, and relentless, and when they attacked, they didn't just kill. They tore through you, as though you were nothing more than meat. It wasn't a fight. It was survival." Liam's hands gripped the desk in front of him, the memories flooding back. The classroom was silent, the students absorbing his words. "I fought," Liam said, his voice quieter now. "I fought harder than I've ever fought in my life. I used every piece of tech I could find, rigged up traps, tried to outsmart them. But nothing worked. Nothing stopped them. They just kept coming." The students could feel the weight of his story now, the gravity of what he had endured. The teacher, standing off to the side, watched silently, his expression unreadable. "And then came the worst part," Liam said, his voice tight. "I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only human on that cursed planet. But I wasn't. There were others. Other survivors, scavengers who had come to Dreleth before me. They were humans, just like me. But they weren't the same anymore. They had been on that planet for so long, living in constant fear and violence, that they had lost themselves. They weren't just surviving. They were hunting, killing for sport. They weren't the people I used to know. They were monsters. Liam sat down, his hands still shaking slightly from the memories he had just shared. He had told them about Drilleth, but there was so much more. That planet wasn't just about surviving the creatures. It was about the people who had lived there, too, the other survivors. The scavengers who had been there far longer than he had. They were the true nightmare of that world. The class had remained silent for a long time after Liam had finished speaking. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, a mixture of awe, disbelief, and fear. But now, as the classroom finally came back to life, the students began to murmur among themselves. Some were asking questions, others were whispering with skepticism, but all of them were intrigued. One student, a young alien from the planet Psylocke, raised his hand slowly. "Liam, you said the survivors were different. What do you mean by that? Were they all like you?" Liam looked at the alien, his eyes narrowing, and then he looked away, staring out of the window, lost in thought for a moment. The question brought back memories he wasn't sure he wanted to relive. "They weren't like me," he said softly. "I was only on Drilleth for a few weeks. They had been there for years, maybe even longer. The planet doesn't just change your body, it changes your mind. You're not the same person after that kind of experience. The longer you stay, the more you become like the planet itself, surviving, but losing yourself in the process. That's what happened to the others." Liam paused, gathering his thoughts. He had never fully explained the horrors of Drilleth, especially not the people who had been there before him. He knew it was a part of the story they needed to hear, but he wasn't sure if they were ready for it. Yet, if he didn't share it now, they might never truly understand what kind of world they were talking about. "I met a man," Liam said, his voice suddenly quiet. His name was Cal. He had been on Drilleth for over a decade. He was one of the first survivors, someone who had come to the planet with a group of explorers. The rest of his team was dead. He was the last one left. He told me that after the first few months, he had to make a choice. Either give in to the planet's pull and become just like the creatures, or keep his humanity and risk losing everything. The class listened intently, the room now still as the students hung on every word. "He chose the creatures," Liam continued, his voice colder now. "He didn't just adapt to Drilleth. He became a part of it. He started hunting, killing for sport. His mind wasn't the same anymore. It was like he was dead inside, but his body kept moving. He was the predator now, not just to the creatures of Drilleth, but to anyone who crossed his path." Liam shook his head, trying to shake the memory of Cal's hollow eyes. "When I met him, I thought maybe he was just a broken man. But no. The longer I stayed on that planet, the more I realized something terrifying. He wasn't just one survivor. There were more like him. They had given up their humanity entirely. They were no longer people. They were something else, something dangerous." The class was silent again, and the teacher, still standing in the corner, finally spoke up. "Liam, what happened to Cull? And these others?" Liam's face darkened. "I had no choice but to run." Cale wasn't the only one who had gone rogue. The other survivors were the same. They lived in constant fear of the predators, but they also had learned to control them. They used the beasts to hunt other survivors. It was chaos. The planet had taken everything from them, everything that made them human. His voice was heavy now, each word sounding like it was being dragged from deep inside him. "I barely escaped with my life. I had to use every trick I knew to survive. I had to hide, run, fight back. And when I finally left that world, I promised myself I would never go back." Liam's hands gripped the edge of the desk as he leaned forward, his eyes meeting those of the class. "You want to know about Deathworlds? They're not just about surviving predators. They're about surviving yourself. Drilleth didn't just break people. It turned them into monsters. It was a place where survival meant becoming something else. Something dark. The class sat in stunned silence. The teacher nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. He had heard rumors about such places, but hearing it from a human who had lived through it was another thing entirely. The weight of Liam's words sank in, and a new understanding began to spread through the room. The alien from Psylocke raised a trembling hand. "Liam, you say that you barely escaped. What happened after that? What did you do?" Liam paused, looking down at the floor. The memory of Drelef haunted him, a dark presence that refused to let him go. "I ran," he said simply. "I ran as fast as I could. But even after I left, the planet followed me. It changed me. I've seen things since then, things that no human should ever witness. Drelef didn't just change me physically. It changed something inside me. And now I carry that with me everywhere I go." He met their eyes one by one. Surviving a death world isn't about strength or courage. It's about what you're willing to lose to stay alive. And for those who are left on Drelef, they've lost everything. They're not human anymore. They're just surviving. And that's the scariest part of all. As Liam finished, the class sat in silence. No one spoke. They didn't know what to say. They had asked for the story, but they hadn't been prepared for the dark truth that came with it. There were no heroes in Deathworlds, only survivors. And not all of them came back human. Liam stood up and walked toward the door. "I don't tell this story for sympathy," he said quietly. "I tell it because you need to understand. If you ever find yourselves on a world like Drelef, remember this: some places are meant to break you. And if you survive, you might not be the same when you leave." With those final words, he walked out of the room, leaving the class behind to digest the harsh truth of his story. The students would never look at the universe the same way again. Liam's words echoed in the minds of the students as they sat in stunned silence. The stories he had shared about Drelef, the creatures, and the broken survivors were more than they had bargained for. The class had thought they were merely hearing tales of an adventurous human who had survived a harsh planet. But what Liam had given them was far more than that. He had given them a glimpse into a nightmare, a world that had taken everything from him and left him with nothing but the scars. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, the students slowly began to file out, still processing what they had heard. They had heard of Deathworlds before in their studies, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it was something else entirely. They weren't just learning about the dangers of hostile planets, they were learning about the price of survival itself. Liam, however, stayed behind. He wasn't done. He had promised to tell this story, and there was still more to share. The other students had left, but the teacher stayed behind as well, silently watching Liam with an understanding look. He had seen the human struggle before, but this was different. The teacher approached him slowly. "Liam," he began softly, "I know you're not finished. There's more, isn't there?" Liam turned to face him, his eyes dark with the weight of his past. "There's always more," he muttered, his voice distant. The teacher nodded. "I know, but maybe now is the time to finish. You've shared so much with them. Maybe it's time to share the rest with me, with the ones who understand." Liam looked at him for a long moment, weighing whether to continue. Finally, with a deep sigh, he nodded. He sat down at the desk, the weight of everything pressing down on him once again. "I haven't told you everything," Liam said slowly. "What happened on Drelef didn't stop when I left the planet. It didn't stop when I came here." The teacher's face softened. He had known that there was more, but hearing it out loud made him brace himself for what was to come. Liam rubbed his face, trying to gather his thoughts. "After I escaped Drelef, I didn't think I'd ever look back. I thought I was free. But every day, something followed me. A part of that world stayed with me. The fear, the creatures, the people who had turned into monsters. And I began to realize something terrifying. I wasn't just running from Drelef. I was running from myself." He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the memories pressing down on him. "When I arrived on the next station, I tried to live a normal life. But Drilleth didn't let me go. It was always there, in the corner of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the horrors, the creatures, and the faces of the survivors who had lost themselves. The teacher listened intently, but he could see the deep pain in Liam's eyes. "What happened after you left?" he asked gently, knowing that the answer was probably far worse than he could imagine. Liam shook his head slowly. "I thought I was going crazy. I started seeing things, shadows in the corner of my eye, strange sounds when I was alone. I couldn't trust myself. I thought I was losing my mind, but then I realized it wasn't just in my head. It was real." The next day, the class gathered once again. But this time, there was an air of tension that hadn't been there before. The students were nervous, unsure of what Liam would share next. They had heard his stories of unimaginable horrors, creatures that could tear a human apart in seconds, and the constant fight for survival. But there was something else behind his eyes, something darker, something more personal that they hadn't fully grasped. As they filed into the classroom, Liam was already sitting at his desk, his hands resting on the table, fingers twitching as though they were itching to do something. The teacher noticed this and walked over to him, giving him a silent nod of understanding. Liam met his gaze, but there was no smile, no reassurance, just a silent agreement that the stories would continue. The class fell silent as the bell rang. Liam stood up, his expression unreadable, and began to speak in a calm, controlled voice, but with a hint of something else, a weight that pressed against every word he spoke. "I didn't want to keep talking about Drilleth. Not because it's over, but because it's not. The day I left, I thought I was free. But the truth is, I've never truly left Drilleth. It follows me. And that's something you can't understand until you've seen what I've seen." The students leaned forward, sensing that this story would be different from the others. There was a depth to Liam's voice, a sense of loss that hadn't been there before. They could see the toll his experiences had taken on him. It wasn't just the physical scars. It was the emotional burden that he carried, and it weighed heavy on him. Liam continued, his voice low, almost a whisper. "When I first left Drilleth, I thought the worst was over. I thought I could find peace, maybe even make a life for myself somewhere else. But every time I looked over my shoulder, every time I closed my eyes, I could feel them there. The creatures, the ones that didn't die on that planet, the ones that followed me. They were always there, lurking just outside my vision, waiting for the moment when I would be weak." A shiver ran through the class as they tried to imagine what Liam had gone through. It was one thing to hear about the creatures from a textbook, but it was another to hear about them from someone who had survived them, someone who had lived through the hell of Drilleth and carried its weight with him. "There were nights," Liam continued, his voice barely audible, "when I would wake up in the dark, and I would hear their whispers. I thought I was going mad. But no, it wasn't madness. It was them. They were communicating, tracking me. And it wasn't just the creatures. It was everything about that planet. The planet itself had become a part of me. It was alive with memories, with things that wouldn't let me go." The students sat in stunned silence. They had heard about the physical dangers of Deathworlds, predators, extreme climates, the fight for survival, but they had never heard about the psychological scars that a planet could leave. To live with the memories of such a place, to be constantly hunted, to never truly be free of the horrors. It was something they couldn't comprehend, not fully. But they didn't need to understand. They just needed to listen. "The worst part," Liam said, his voice shaking ever so slightly, "was when I realized that I wasn't just fighting the creatures anymore. I wasn't just fighting the planet. I was fighting myself. The more I tried to run, the more I became like the monsters I was running from. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was something else, something darker." The teacher watched Liam carefully, sensing the struggle within him. It was clear now that Liam wasn't just talking about surviving a hostile planet. He was talking about something far deeper, something that had changed him in ways he couldn't even begin to explain. The teacher opened his mouth to speak, but Liam cut him off before he could say anything. "I didn't want to become like them," Liam said, his voice fierce. "I didn't want to lose myself. But on Deathworlds, you have no choice. You adapt or you die. And when you adapt, you become something you never thought you could be. It's not just about surviving. It's about becoming something that can't be recognized as human anymore, and you don't even realize it until it's too late." Liam paused, his eyes distant, as if seeing something no one else could. "I came here to tell you that, but I also came here to warn you. Because Deathworlds don't let go. Even if you escape them, even if you get off the planet, they follow you." The room was deathly quiet now. The students couldn't even process what they were hearing. They had come to class thinking they would hear a tale of survival, a story about an impossible challenge overcome by a determined human. But what Liam had shared with them was far more than that. It was a warning, a glimpse into a reality they couldn't begin to understand. The final bell rang, signaling the end of the class, but no one moved. The students were still stunned, still processing the weight of Liam's words. The room felt heavy, like the air itself was thick with the stories he had shared. There was no rush to leave, no chatter or laughter, just a collective silence, as if they were all trying to comprehend what had just been revealed to them. Liam stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the students. They were no longer just classmates to him. They were witnesses, witnesses to a truth about survival, about humanity, that most couldn't even begin to imagine. But they would remember this moment. The stories he had shared were not just his own. They were lessons for them, for anyone who might ever step foot on a Deathworld, and maybe for everyone who thought they knew what it meant to fight for survival. Liam took a deep breath and turned to the teacher, who had been standing off to the side, watching quietly. He nodded to the teacher, silently thanking him for allowing him to speak. "Liam," the teacher said, his voice soft but firm, "you've done more than just share your story. You've shown them something. You've shown them what it truly means to survive, what it costs." Liam looked down, his face a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something like relief, but buried deep beneath years of trauma. "I didn't come here to teach," he muttered, almost to himself. "I just wanted to be normal." The teacher smiled, a faint, understanding smile. "Normal is a relative term, Liam. You've shown them that survival has a price, and sometimes it's a price we never realize we're paying until it's too late." Liam didn't respond. He simply nodded. His journey had never been about finding peace. It had been about enduring, about living. And in a way, that's what the students had learned today. They had learned that survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about enduring the scars, both seen and unseen. It was about being able to live with what you had to become in order to survive. As the students slowly began to leave, they turned to Liam. Some whispered to each other, others simply walked past him, their expressions a mix of awe and uncertainty. But all of them knew one thing for sure. They would never forget Liam's stories. They would never look at survival the same way again. Liam stood at the front of the class, watching them go. He had shared a part of himself with them, something no one else had ever been told, something that made them realize that the real danger wasn't just in the creatures of Deathworlds, but in what it did to those who survived. It turned them into something else. And sometimes, that was the hardest battle of all. Once the last student had left, the classroom door shut with a soft click, and Liam was left alone with his thoughts. The teacher walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did good today, Liam. They'll never forget what you've shared with them." Liam didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring out the window at the distant stars. The same stars that had guided him through the darkest of times, the stars that had watched as he fought to survive. "Yeah," Liam said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I just hope they understand that survival isn't always something you can walk away from. Sometimes it follows you forever. The teacher didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of Liam's words lingered in the air, a haunting reminder that survival, once paid for, could never truly be forgotten. The scars, both physical and emotional, remained. And sometimes, those scars were the true legacy of a death world. Liam turned away from the window, his face hardening once again. He knew the truth now. He knew that the battle for survival was never truly over. It never ended. And as long as he carried those scars, as long as he carried the memory of what he had seen, he would never be free. But that was the price of surviving a death world. And that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. With one last glance at the empty classroom, Liam walked out the door. His story wasn't over. It had only just begun. 2 seconds. You said 6. ChatGPT said. Could you clarify what you're asking for with sticks? Are you requesting a new scene, part, or continuation of something specific? Let me know, and I'll be happy to help.